Good evening. Welcome to the fifth lecture in the public lecture series on the Wisconsin Idea, Past and Present. This lecture series is part of a new course being taught for the first time this fall under the auspices of the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Chad Goldberg regrets that he cannot be present tonight due to the observance of the Jewish holidays. I'm Professor John Delamater from the Sociology Department, and I will introduce tonight's speaker and moderate the question and answer session after the lecture. The Wisconsin Idea has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society, an aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that the university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty of the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state about how knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past, continues to do so today, and I have no doubt will do so in the future. I encourage you to participate actively through our course website, www.wiscidea.com, and our Facebook page. If you are live tweeting this or subsequent lectures, please use the hashtag WiscIdea. The Sociology Department is offering this course on a shoestring budget out of our academic and supplies and expenses budget. If you would like to contribute to this project to allow us to offer real-time broadcasts or to otherwise improve our offerings this semester or in the future, please consider making a contribution to the Department of Sociology Annual Fund. You can do so through the site or by going to the Wisconsin, I'm going to not get it right. Go through the course website. We are fortunate to continue our lecture series tonight with a lecture by Dr. Richard Wagner titled Academics Shaping the Wisconsin Dialogue on LGBT History. Like all of our speakers, he is graciously donating his time and expertise free of charge out of a commitment to public service. Dick Wagner earned his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1971. In the spring of 1980, he was elected to the Dane County Board of Supervisors, and by the fall of that year, Dane County had passed a non-discrimination ordinance that he co-sponsored to protect gays and lesbians. He worked with State Representative David Clarenbach on the passage of Wisconsin's first in the nation gay rights law in 1982. And he was present with Governor Anthony Earl when he signed the Consenting Adults Bill in 1983. In 1983, he was appointed by Governor Earl to co-chair the first in the nation Governor's Council on Lesbian and Gay Issues. The council heard hearings around the state of Wisconsin regarding the status of government services for gays and lesbians. Its members educated the Wisconsin press on gay issues. They successfully obtained the cooperation of the State Medical Society to prevent an AIDS panic when the disease made itself known in the state of Wisconsin. As a member of the Dane County Board, Dick successfully requested the county executive to remove a member of the Board of Health for homophobic remarks about AIDS patients, a case that went all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. He obtained a Dane County Council opinion that the county nursing home must accept AIDS patients under the county's non-discrimination ordinance. In 1988, he became the Dane County Board chairperson, at that time the highest office any gay person had held in the state. As chair, he nurtured Senator Tammy Baldwin's early career and appointed her to chair a Dane County task force for the comprehensive county response to the AIDS crisis. When the Network for Gay and Lesbian Public Officials hosted their 5th annual conference in Madison in 1989, he and Supervisor Tammy Baldwin co-chaired the local host committee. He created the first Madison Pink Plaque Tour of gay historic sites for conference attendees. In the 1990s, he served on the board of the Madison AIDS Network and helped push successful efforts to construct the Rodney Scheel House for persons with AIDS, HIV in Madison. In 2005, he joined the Board of Fair Wisconsin to fight the constitutional amendment against marriage equality. After the defeat, he continued to serve on the board until 2012 as the organization rebuilt itself and went on to obtain Wisconsin domestic partner legislation. In 2009, he was appointed to and elected chair of the Dane County Regional Transit Authority until it was abolished by the state legislature in 2011. He has served or serves on the Wisconsin Arts Board, the Wisconsin Humanities Committee, the Board of Downtown Madison, Inc., the Madison Plan Commission, the Madison Urban Design Commission, the Madison Landmarks Commission, Historic Madison, the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation, the Board of Albrecht Botanical Gardens, and the Board of the Friends of UW Libraries. I met and got to know Dick through our mutual interest in improving public transportation in the city of Madison and Dane County. I participated in a number of meetings with him over several years, focused on improving mass transit, including rail transit, and by providing opportunities for all to use public transit. Dick was always prepared. He listened attentively. He usually had a broader grasp of the issues than the other people involved in the process, and I was always very impressed with his contributions. So it really is a pleasure for me to invite him tonight, to introduce him tonight. Since retiring in 2005, he has been researching and presenting on Wisconsin gay history, including bi-monthly articles in Our Lives magazine. He hopes there is a book in there someday. Please join me in welcoming Dick Wagner.
Thank you, John. I asked him to cut that, but I didn't get far enough on that cutting, I think. It was way too long. I also want to thank Chad Goldberg, Patrick Brenzel, and Joe Elder for asking me to join this lecture series. And for Chad, I certainly wish him a good new year, and for any others observing the Jewish holiday. Some of you may be looking forward to the vice presidential debate, and maybe that's why a few folks aren't here tonight. And I'm not going to touch on elections, but we will hit a little bit on vice. The gay author Larry Kramer, you might know him from the movie The Normal Heart, said, "I don't think you can be a people until you have a history." Let me just do a quick check. Is the microphone working for folks? You can. Okay, good. And so my interest as I retired has been to try and find out about Wisconsin gay history. You heard about how I participated in much of it, but I know that there was much more. And too often, I think there's a preconception that gay history occurred only in the East Coast or the West Coast, and the Midwest gets ignored in that sort of bi-coastal formulation of it. So I want to explore tonight how a number of Wisconsin academics have become for me a source on Wisconsin gay history, that they were part of the dialogue on evolving ideas and the narratives in this state, and that's very much a part of the Wisconsin idea of how the academics help shape the public dialogue on policy. I think this is a clear interaction in the Wisconsin idea. Now, let me do a little bit about terms. LBGT is the modern term. I'm not going to use it much, and it really wasn't much in use until the late 1990s. And I'm basically going to stop in the 1980s. Perhaps in the questions I can deal with some other aspects of that I might not cover. My favorite term is just gay folks or gays. But basically, LBGT is a shortcut for non-normative heterosexuality. That's what all of the initials stand for. And for most of the period in my research, while these have been focused on gay men and the antagonism often that existed toward them, these folks weren't feeling any more warmly to any of the other initials that were on that list either. So I want to give a thanks to UW Archives for their help with the project, and note that they have a wonderful project underway right now, creating an LBGT archive on the Madison area, particularly as it relates to those interactions with the university. Now, one of the things that we heard early in that first lecture about John Bascom and the Wisconsin idea was how the Capitol and the UW are linked. And I want to talk about how some of the academics here at the university stepped out of their ivory tower, did some of that public service, and in part reveal something of gay history in the state to us. Now, my interest in these academics is three things. First, what they found in their research. Second, what they shared about that, what they published. And third, what we can hear with today's ears is a little bit different than perhaps just what they published. So I do want to note that I'm not going to be talking about a number of Wisconsin academics who you could easily also have a lecture about, who contributed to the much broader discussion about homosexuality. I think of people like Ruth Bleier and her book Gender and Science, or George Mossey writing on masculinity, or Evie Beck about Jewish lesbians. But I'm focused on those who were interacting with the state and with the state dialogue. So let's begin that state dialogue, and it begins in the territorial period. Now, Wisconsin, when it became a territory in 1836, inherited the laws of the territory of Michigan. Michigan, in those laws, had a 3-year penalty for sodomy, which was also described as the crime against nature. Wasn't enough for the Wisconsinites. The territorial legislature changed that to 5 years, feeling a deeper penalty was needed. Now, part of this is that, of course, we're dealing with negative stereotypes about gays or homosexuals. Here's just 2 actually slightly later versions, a demonic version, or again, the effeminacy. But it's important to remember that the narrative as it began in the territorial period is about individual criminal acts. And so that's the dialogue that Wisconsin starts about gay people. Next, I want to jump to the anti-vice crusades at the beginning of the 20th century. This is also, we got the Wisconsin idea enunciated by Van Hise in this first decade of the 20th century. And during this period, the sodomy laws in the state were part of those laws on public morality. Now, the anti-vice crusades was a result in part because urban growth had exploded in the 19th century. And you got red light districts where before you might have had a few occasional houses of prostitution, you now had huge districts where vice was thought to flourish. One of the great publishers of this was W.T. Steed in a book in 1894 entitled If Christ Came to Chicago. He sold 700,000 copies of this book, which was a phenomenal number at the end of the 19th century. And he had a color-coded map of the Levee district in Chicago, which is where vice flourished down there, and he described it in quite lurid detail. During the same period, this oldest profession of prostitution got renamed as the social evil, and you had this hysteria which occurred about the white slave trade or crossing state boundaries, which led to the Mann Act of 1910. Now, one of the favorite activities of these vice reformers were slumming tours of the underworld. They would go down and often take reporters with them and report on the evil vice conditions that existed. And you have to think about that perhaps there's a little middle-class consumerism hearing about these lurid tales that were going on in the poorer parts of their cities. Now, turning to Wisconsin in the vice effort, we get Senator Howard Teasdale. He was a Republican from Sparta. He was actually an associate or friendly with Bob La Follette, so part of that progressive effort. And when 1913, he got appointed to chair the Wisconsin Committee on the Social Evil. He went to Chicago because he knew that's where the reformers had had some practice. There was a report from 1911 called The Social Evil in Chicago. It was a national model report. And so Teasdale, wanting to learn from this expertise, went down to Chicago and talked to the Chicago reformers. He came back, he hired investigators, they went around the state, they filed reports. All those reports still exist at the Historical Society, luckily. One of the things that Teasdale also did was he surveyed district attorneys on their non-enforcement of morality laws and the drink laws. There were quite a number of district attorneys in the state with all of its German population thought it was better not to force Sunday closing laws in their particular counties or jurisdictions because it would be unpopular to enforce that kind of law. So Teasdale himself is the one who wrote the lengthy report, which was published in 1914. Now, I mentioned he went to Chicago. That Chicago Vice report of 1911 had an extensive section on that Midwestern city's gay life. Just pages and pages of testimony about how gay life existed in the Midwest here in that period. And interestingly enough, in 1908, a gentleman by the name of Edward Prime Stevenson wrote a book called The Intersexes, A History of Similisexualism as a Problem of Social Life. I always have to be careful because that's not a term we would use today, but people were still trying to grasp how they would talk about these experiences back then. Anyway, In his book in 1908, he lists Milwaukee as one of 8 homosexual capitals in America. So clearly you had an active gay life occurring in the state at the time when Teasdale was creating his investigation. Now, Teasdale in his report basically chose to ignore homosexuality, even though in his own investigative reports he had uncovered several instances of homosexuals amongst the vice world in the state. He did reprint the state sodomy laws as part of those laws on morality. They were in that section of the statute which titled Offenses Against Chastity, Morality, and Decency. But Teasdale's own focus was on alcoholism and drink, and he was a sort of incipient prohibitionist, and he was trying to show the link between non-marital sexual intercourse and booze. And so his report focused that way. So he really wasn't focused on the homosexuality, even though that was part of the vice world of the day. Now, one of the people who spoke in front of Teasdale's committee was this gentleman, Professor E.A. Ross from the university here. He was an early sociologist, and Teasdale was so impressed with Ross's testimony before his committee, he said that it fully covered the entire problem. Now, Ross, in speaking to the committee, said he felt that vice would rot the foundations of society, so my feeling is there should be no toleration. Totally anti-vice platform. Now, interestingly, Ross was not necessarily the most acute local observer. He told the committee, I have not heard anything at all of there being any commercialized prostitution in this town, speaking of Madison. Teasdale's investigations, however, had uncovered 21 immoral places in the city, so somehow Ross had missed these in his own views. Ross's views were also echoed in front of Teasdale by Victor Berger, who was head of the Socialist Party and editor of the Socialist newspaper. This shows the campus about the time Ross was speaking. This is in 1910. Another instance that Teasdale overlooked was this case of the girl man of Milwaukee, who was Cora Anderson, and this is a story that was written up in the Wisconsin Magazine of History. This was a gentleman who presented himself as Ralph Quirino. He was a self-proclaimed native of Bolivia. He was actually born Cora Anderson of African-American father and a mother who was Potawatomi and Cherokee. He assumed man's dress to obtain work because the men's wages were so much better. He worked in a stockroom at twice the woman's wages that she would have received. Cora Anderson, or Ralph Farrow, was quoted, I thought of myself as a man. He fell in love with a Dorothy Kielanowski, and they were married. And then in a 1941 trial, because his wife had been upset that he was seeing another woman, so she turned him in. He was forced, or Cora Anderson was forced to wear a dress. She got a suspended sentence, and her comment was, my heart and soul are those of a man more than a woman. So here was again another non-gender conforming kind of presentation overlooked at the time. Next, I want to turn to John Gillen. This is a young John Gillen. He became a professor also of sociology at the university. Later, President Elvium would describe him as an eminent criminologist. He was recruited to come by Ross to Wisconsin. He was from Hudson, Iowa. He got a BA at Grinnell. He got a PhD in sociology from Columbia in 1906. And while he was there, he also did divinity studies at Union Theological Seminary, and he was ordained clergyman in the Church of the Brethren. So he had quite a background. In that tradition of Wisconsin's public service, he served on the Madison Police and Fire Commission, a great city commission. He also served on the Wisconsin Parole Board from 35 to 39. He was appointed by Phil LaFollette, again, in relation to that progressive. He favored elastic parole and probation, which were relatively new then, and he supported the prison forest camp system, again, an innovation. Now, if you're a criminologist, you go to study at a place like Waupun, shown here in an early postcard view. And so what Gillen did, he was working on a study which he called crimogenesis, or the origin of crime. And in the 1930s, he studied the inmates at Waupun and also the Central State Hospital, which is where the criminally insane were housed. The Campus Research Committee supported Gillen's research for a number of years, enabled him to employ research assistants. Gillen's own views was that criminology too long had been descriptive rather than scientific, and so he was trying to get a scientific mode to criminology. Amongst the things that Gillen did, and this is quite interesting, was that where inmates were literate, he asked them to write their own autobiographies. So this could supplement the information derived from the interviews and the prison records. And this gives us a wealth of information in some instances. Now, there were 1,700 inmates at the institutions. He studied 486 of them, but he included all 29 sodomists who were there at Waupun. And these were almost all male homosexuals, though one was there for apparently bestiality. His research got published in 1946, probably after he had done the research because of the paper shortage during World War II, which had curtailed some publication. But we begin to see gay life glimpsed in his work from the 1930s. Most of the men who were convicted had pleaded guilty at bench trials. They did not have attorneys, something we would think strange today. 1/3 of them were from Milwaukee. 4, it was interestingly noted, were from Winnebago County, and this county was, quote, reputed to have a large number of homosexuals. Their average sentence was 1 to 5 years, and the observation was many had been practicing the diversion since adolescence. Now, one of the important things in Gillen's study that we begin to see, and we'll see this in several other studies, is that homosexuals were inserting themselves into the narrative. And remember, we began with the narrative that the legislature was penalizing sexual acts as a criminal activity. There's a book by Henry Minton called Departing from Deviance, A History of Homosexual Rights and Emancipatory Science in America. He covers a number of sex researchers in the 1930s who looked at how gay men and these sex researchers interacted. He notes amongst his comments, studies of prison homosexuality provided an opening for homosexual voices to be heard. And this is, I think, Minton's great insight. He notes, many seized the opportunity to use their role as research subjects as a means of educating the investigators about homosexuality and the lives of homosexuals. So this was a way for gay people to actually insert themselves into that narrative, to start to change that narrative. Minton's observation about these researchers in the 30s, and they were in New York, the ones that he studied, noted they seized the opportunity for self-expression and social change. Minton himself considered it an early form of coming out. So Gillen, in part in his research and in his book, has this opportunity for gay men to begin to insert themselves into the narrative about homosexuality in the state. Gillen notes in his comments that men were unexpectedly truthful about their early lives and about everything else except the circumstances of the crimes. It's always hard to admit the crime, I guess, if you're in prison. He noted that numerous factors go to produce homosexuality. He noted that the sodomists included men of both low and high intelligence, that they distinctly preferred homosexual love relationships, were fond of female pursuits, and had the physical characteristics of the female. He plays a little bit into stereotypes there. He noted one was named Lipstick Bill, which again plays to the stereotype, and another played with dolls, again a stereotype. And he notes that they came across from class and religious lines. But he's beginning to change the narrative. One of the things that Gillen has in the book is an essay on homosexuality. So he's not just dealing with these as individuals who are criminals, he's dealing with them as a class of individuals. He talks about theories from Freud and Jung. He has German sources. He includes Magnus Hirschfeld, the early German gay rights activist, who was very active in the field and almost got Germany's law repealed before the Nazis came in. He had included recent works from 1936 and Havelock Ellis on sexual inversion. Basically, Gillen's essay in his book, which he published, was a non-sin, non-criminal framing of homosexuality. This is a real beginning change in the narrative in the state. And he had noted some theories supported everyone is potentially a bisexual. Now, we also begin to see some more about gay life in the 1930s in Gillen's book. He notes that in the community from which he was committed, he has a long history of homosexuality, but no records of previous arrest, i.e., you might have been existing in the community, but they hadn't caught you. Another never had any long-standing love affair with a man, but apparently had many casual experiences. Yet another was observed a confirmed homosexual from age 16. He had no records of previous arrest and had not been recognized as a pervert in his home community until just before he was arrested. And yet of another contact, he was as circumstanced as possible, usually made contacts, as many as possible, at teachers' conventions. So one of the things that you're seeing then is that there's a lot of this gay love going on in the state, unbeknownst to most folks. Now, they had views on their own lives, and this again is those gay men inserting themselves into the narrative of this debate on homosexuality. Some felt homosexual love to be finer than heterosexual. Great debate. Another notes he was brought up in that condition, i.e. it was something inherent, not something he sort of chose. Another, this is one of the strongest and purest of homosexual attachments. Another observed strong mutual love. Yet another showed considerable insight to the genesis of homosexual attitudes. And another commented, I have here learned the value and the only lesson of charity, never qualified to throw the first stone. So this is the 1930s, and these are gay people saying, you have the wrong narrative about homosexuality. We want to change it, and this Wisconsin academic helps give voice to those voices of gay men. This is certainly much pre-Stonewall. Now, one of the most interesting cases that Gillen found was that of Labogala. He was an African-American man, and he presented himself as from the French Sudan. He was a lecturer. There was a whole circuit of what was termed Africans on stage, and they earned their living by talking and making stage presentations. Remember, this is before TV. Movies were just sort of coming in. So people went and heard lectures. It was an academic kind of thing to do. He spoke in 1933 at Madison Central High, and then the same year down at Kenosha Methodist Church. He was so well received there, they invited him back to speak again down at the Kenosha Church. And then he got arrested for having oral sex in Kenosha. He was sent to Waupun, where he served 1 to 5 years, and later he was remanded back to New York under a parole violation. He's died and buried in Attica with a Labogala tombstone in the New York prison. When they actually tried to deport him to the French Sudan because he was, an undesirable, they found out he was not from French Sudan, but he was an African-American from Baltimore who had made up this whole persona. Here you see a picture of him, which was in a book. Alfred Knopf actually published an autobiography of Labogala. He clearly was putting on a whole costume here for his act as a native of French Sudan. But here again in Labogala, he did a 68-page autobiography. Now, it parallels the one that was published by Knopf in New York, but it's full of a sex life as well. And so again, he's talking as a man who had a very active sex life. But he talks also that he's in sympathy with your cause to the researchers. So again, he's a gay man seizing the chance to get into the narrative. He notes, when I sought to discuss, I do have a slide on this. When I sought to discuss the problem of sex inversion with anyone, be he student or artisan, he's invariably held me under suspicion. So there was a difficulty gay men had in inserting themselves into this discussion. One of the things that he observed in his 68-page autobiography was that during the Great War, the American recruiters for the military turned him down because of the sexual arrest records that he had. But the British Army was manpower starved, and they enlisted him, and he fought in the war. And his own observation in the autobiography that he wrote to Gillen was, strange as it may seem, the British Army was not demoralized by my having served. Clearly an early case of don't ask, don't tell, or the British Army, we don't care, we'll take you anyway. So Gillen's study, while still judgmentally in many cases, dealing with effeminacy and stereotypes in some cases, began to shift the dialogue in Wisconsin about homosexuality from simply criminal acts to a group of people and to something more scientific. His study also shows that there were lots of gays and they were having active sex life in the state from early ages. And he was able to begin this inserting of gay men's narrative into the discussion. Next, I want to turn to Truax Field. Now, we just think of it as an airport, but during World War II, it was an active military base. Some pictures here. And the study that was done out of Truax was done by Professor E.L. Servinghouse, who was an MD. Servinghouse was also a Midwesterner. He came from New Albany. He got his BA from UW in 1916 and his MD from Harvard in 1921. From 1927, he was a physician with Wisconsin General Hospital, the forerunner of university hospitals. He authored Endocrine Therapy and General Practice. He spoke at the Memorial Union's Friendship and Marriage Series. He was a member of First Congregational Church. He was an exchange lecturer to medical schools in Argentina, and he assisted UN Relief and Rehab, again, part of that reach out, that Wisconsin idea, CERT. Well, again, Truax was a military base. Its focus was on training radio technicians who flew in bombers, and actually the kids in town would collect used radios and take them out to the base so they could disassemble them and learn some of the radio techniques and things like that. Servinghouse's study was published in 1945, this is right near the end of the war, in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. He had a co-author who was Major John Chornack, who was from the Truax base. And the subjects were those who had been identified as homosexual at Truax, and they were under diagnostic observation in the psychiatric ward. Now, this would have been a younger cohort than the ones that Gillen studied in the 30s. So this is the 40s, and these are probably younger men. Now, he notes that supposedly these men voluntarily brought their homosexuality to the attention of the chaplain, the unit commander, or the medical officer. You kind of wonder what happens with the chaplain confidentiality or the medical office confidentiality at this period, but apparently Army rules trumped it all. Now, Servinghouse had a theory about the causes of homosexuality. He thought that there might be elevated levels of the female hormone or estrogen in homosexuals, and so he collected urine samples, using them sort of as guinea pigs, and he compared them to urine samples of people who were presumed not to be homosexuals. His test results weren't conclusive. It didn't prove his theory. But a good academic, he and Chornack encouraged further research. Always a good thing to do. Here, a slide of University Hospital, or Wisconsin General Hospital, as it was known on the campus at that point. And again, in this study, Servinghouse had them write their own stories concerning their sexual habits. So here's again a case where non-normative heterosexuals could insert their story into the life of the state's public discourse. He notes, all these cases were extreme types and have been aggressively homosexual both actively and passively since late childhood and early adolescence. He notes the homosexuals would probably be termed overt homosexuals. They had participated apparently without conflict in a wide variety of homosexual practices. These homosexual stories were remarkably similar, and that our subjects were all definitely aggressive in their homosexual activities. In fact, 4 of them were known to be members of an organized group. It's generally thought gays weren't getting organized much till the 50s when the early homophile organizations got started, and then after the 69, here you have in 45 in Madison, there's an organized gay group. Kind of surprising to find that in pre-Stonewall history. Now, part of the story that they conveyed to Servinghouse also was that the square, which had been darkened in World War II, some energy saving, was a cruising area. I recently had an interview with an 89-year-old gay man who had been raised in Madison, and he indeed describes the square as one of the cruising areas. Regarding the comment that Servinghouse discovered about this sort of gay organization or gay club, I don't have the links, but I'd love to think it's tied to Bob Neal and Edgar Hellam. These were the 2 gay men who founded Pendarvis in the 1930s, which was a guest house and restaurant down there. They were always described in the press as partners, never just as business partners, but as partners. And they lived together at Pendarvis, as well as running the little operation that they had there. And so they moved to Madison during World War II after they shut down Pendarvis during the war. And so I somehow think maybe there's some links there, but I don't know that yet for sure. Anyway, these men, as part of the study, they rejected the sickness label. And this, you have to remember that the military in World War II was screening out any homosexuals they could. They had psychiatrists looking at the recruits, trying to keep them out. And again, this was about pure status. It wasn't about whether they had committed homosexual acts at the military, just if they were homosexual, if they had same-sex attraction. But the observations from the study that Surringhouse conducted, the cases would be considered extremely questionable from the standpoint of profiting from any therapy. In fact, therapy was not requested or desired by any of them. They didn't think they were sick, even though the prevailing opinion was that they were thought to be sick. They all expressed difficulty over their sexual excitation because of the stimulation that resulted from their living closely with other soldiers. However, in none of the cases was there a true neurotic type of conflict over homosexuality as such. Notice they did not have a conflict because they were gay. They had a very realistic attitude, realistic anxiety that their homosexuality would lead to a court-martial. Thus, an early recognition that the homophobia of the larger society was the real issue that these gay men had to face. Again, we're talking 1945. This attitude was there. Many of these attitudes also get reflected in this memoir of World War II, A Gay Man from Eagle River, Robert Peters, which writes about his own experience serving in the military during the war. So one of the things the Surringhouse study shows, despite the screening the military was doing, they failed miserably. That indirectly questions the value of those psychiatric reviews. He also shows, again, gay men had very active sex lives. They created networks and organizations. They rejected the sickness that was ascribed to them. And they were aware that the hostility towards themselves was the real problem. Next, I'm going to take another example from a researcher who was associated with the Milwaukee Public Museum. It's interesting that this museum was originally the German-American Academy over in Milwaukee, so it always had some pretensions to an intellectual status as well as just showing objects. And the author of this study was Nancy Lurie. She was an anthropologist. She got her BA from UW, her master's from Chicago, and a doctorate from Northwestern. She was curator and section head of anthropology at the Milwaukee Public Museum. In 1980, she was president of the American Anthropology Association. Her doctorate field research done in 1945 to 47 was among the Winnebago, or today we would know them as the Ho-Chunk. And in 1953, she published an article on the Winnebago Berdache. Now, I have this image of George Catlin, who depicted a Berdache dance amongst the Sauk and Fox First Nation. You may be familiar with that particular tribe. They were associated with Chief Blackhawk, who was in the war that was fought through Wisconsin in the 1830s. The Berdache, or two-spirited, is a term that came from the French traders and their interactions with the Great Lakes Native American tribes. In French, its usage before connections with the Native Americans was referred to a passive partner in sodomy or perhaps a catamite. The actual Ho-Chunk word, which Lurie uses in her article, was siage, and I don't know if my Ho-Chunk pronunciation is correct on that, but she used that frequently as well as the French term berdache. Other later research has shown that the two-spirited traditions existed among other Wisconsin First Nations, including the Menominee, the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, as well as the Ho-Chunk. So this was indeed a non-normative sexuality presentation. Now, in Lurie's reporting, the Berdaches were known as males in female roles. They sometimes married other men. They were men who dressed as women. They could be a bachelor who acted as a foster mother. Now, the tribe had become ashamed of the custom because white people thought it was amusing or evil. And so by 1947, at the time of her research, some said to translate siage as either no good or an unmanly man, and it was often used as an insult or teasing term. Supposedly, the last Winnebago Berdache died over 50 years ago, but there's a little ending to that story, too, in that a present-day two-spirited Ho-Chunk has connected up with Nancy Lurie in recent years, showing that the tradition had not totally died out. Now, in her research, Native views show through in her article. For the Ho-Chunk, the two-spirited was directed to that role during the spirit quest by the moon, who was the female spirit. The Bradash was blessed by the moon. The Bradash had the ability to foretell future events, was a highly honored and respected person, is what Lurie recorded. Interestingly, performed women's tasks better than any normal woman could perform them, was one of the beliefs. I don't know about that one. And there was one whose brothers threatened to kill him if he put on the skirt. Nevertheless, from that point, he effected a combination of male and female clothing, fearing that he would die if he did not at least attempt to follow the directions given to him in his vision of the moon. Now, Lurie didn't directly relate the Bradash to homosexuality, yet clearly it was a non-normative heterosexual view that she was finding here in the native tradition. Again, it was something innate. It was not something that was a choice or preference or a particular act. She showed in her research that the concepts that the First Nation had about the high status, the blessed position, lingered despite the negative European interactions. So next I want to turn to Dr. Benjamin Glover. Dr. Glover was from 1947 an assistant professor of neuropsychiatry at the UW Medical School. He joined after service in World War II. In 1951, he published Observations on Homosexuality Amongst University Students in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. And his first 3 years here at the university were with student health. He also advised the Student Conduct Committee at a time when university policy was mandatory therapeutic discipline if you were found out to be a homosexual. Now, that meant that you were suspended. You had to go get psychotherapy. The psychotherapist had to give you a good report before you could be reinstated to the university under therapeutic discipline in the 40s and 50s. Glover also had that tradition of public service. He served as a member of the Special Review Board on the Wisconsin Sexual Deviant Law, which was actually much worse than the therapeutic discipline that the university was doing. But that's another topic. Now, Glover's study was on 12 cases from student health that he reported on. All were single and male. They were white, though 2 admitted to regularly consort with African Americans. The great majority of his cases were veterans, and Glover knew about this military psychiatric studies because of his own service in the war. Glover's observation was that most homosexuals who had been in the military are found in the secretarial branches, chaplain aides, hospital assistants, photographers. This matches up very closely with the work that Alan Burby has done, Coming Out Under Fire, about gay and lesbians serving in World War II. So here is an early observation, much later confirmed by further research. One of the things that Glover observed was that he had difficulty in that taking some of their own much involved case histories in the more active members of this groups without implicating a large number of well-known homosexuals on campus. So again, there seemed to be this network that existed and that these people had ways of connecting and knowing each other. He also observed that his cases had fairly high status. They were medical and grad students or professional musicians. Here's a picture just showing from Lois, Ireland, a couple of sailors on the campus in 1945, right at the end of the war. These might have been the veterans who were returning to Wisconsin. Now, Glover's observations. A noticeable increase in cases of homosexuality as well as other socially offending sex cases after the war. And the university wasn't alone in Wisconsin in experiencing that. There's correspondence between deans showing that other universities that they were in touch with also had experienced more homosexuality after the war. Maybe people learned something from being in the Army, who knows? Anyway, these people had an intense fear of being caught or being noticeably different. Glover observed the university often saw them when they were in a homosexual panic, and that such appearances were timed with the publication of such local news item concerning exhibitionism or discovery of a group of consorting individuals in town. There was a famous 1948 sex scandal when a whole number of students were suspended from the university for admitting homosexuality and had to face local court cases. Glover also observed that during the first 2 or 3 interviews, there were contradictory kinds of statements. no affairs, well, maybe a few childhood experiences, to innumerable nights of intimacy. Wow, they were progressing, or at least progressing in what they were admitting to. Now, again, Glover, about his subjects, says they were true homosexuals. By now, you had Kinsey published his famous scale of 1 to 6, and so these people probably would have been 6s on that Kinsey scale. He observes they were overt performers of deviant sex, again, some judgment there, practiced with their own sex by reason of personal choice, but without coercion and with enjoyment. They frequently sought the haunts and company engaged in the activities of other homosexuals, again, that network-building social structure going on. He noticed they were different from others of their age group in childhood and definitely in a different social category after puberty. Self-awareness. And most had a favored sexual activity, although all participants admitted they would tolerate another approach if they loved him enough. And again, love is a commonplace word in conversation with homosexuals. Again, you hear the voices of gay men bringing to the narrative that what they were about was not sex, but that very basic human drive for love and relationship. Now, he talked about sort of they frequented certain places. These were 2 places that got frequented in some of the discussions that I've had. The Indian Room in the Monona Hotel, and the cafe in the Belmont Hotel up on the square. This sort of was continuing that tradition from World War II, where the square existed as a cruising ground. About gay lives themselves, often they told their own past stories to each other. This was part of their attempt to have a narrative about their own gay life that would be different than the narrative that society was trying to impose on them. And that while claiming the initial passive part in the initiation of homosexual activity, they later adopted more daring approaches. He noted their favorite terms were gay, queer, queen, and fan. I'd never heard of fan before, but that's apparently part of the record. Taverns and bars, as we've seen, were most often the centers of congregation. And that each homosexual amongst the 12 felt that his present amour was a permanent one, different from the one before. We all hope that that's the case. Anyway, in terms of Glover's conclusions from his study, he said basically there were poor psychotherapeutic results. Only 1 of the 12 made any significant improvement, i.e. presumably some conversion from homosexuality. So the rest apparently were quite happy to stay the way they were. He noted in his therapy, great effort was devoted to encourage in a competitive sense, beginning with sports or games, but he made clear no theater or dramatics was part of what he wanted them to do. And there's a reason for that, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also said, well, there were no scholastic or psychiatric casualties in the group, so as a doctor, he apparently did no harm. And he notes that the stigma of their pattern follow them in time, and their socialization is the most difficult thing in even the relatively enlightened atmosphere of the university. Now you have to understand then, part of the reason that stigma followed them was that the university policy at this point was that if another university they were trying to transfer to, or the military or an employer that they were trying to be employed by, the university would tell them that they were homosexual. So the university was carrying that record for them, even if they did not want to. So, and again, the observation, male homosexuals do not want to change except for the fear of social penalty. So again, the perception that gay men had that homophobia was the real problem, not their own lives. We talked about how they shouldn't do anything in dramatic arts. One of the things that had existed on campus for decades and decades was Hare's Foot. This was a theater troupe where the women's roles were performed by men, shown here in a program for Button Button, which was one of their productions. The men wore elaborate costumes. And in 1948, there was a campus investigation into Hare's Foot because somehow this group surprisingly had attracted a lot of number of gay men. Anyway, Glover's study showed that, again, gays were very present on campus, that there were times of crackdowns or panics. But again, networks of communication and social structure were beginning to exist in the gay community. Active sex lives happened, and that they knew they weren't sick, but social hostility was the cause of their oppression. And again, as human beings, they sought love in their relationships. Now, I'm going to turn to a slightly different beginning discussion. And this begins up in Manitowoc. Here you see the famous car ferry up there loading. And this is pre-Stonewall again. This is 1966. What's happening in Manitowoc this year is that the Young Dems are having their state convention. And they have some resolutions put in by the campus groups. The Madison campus adopted a resolution urging freedom of action for homosexuals, and the Milwaukee campus wanted to decriminalize other certain sex acts. They put all these together basically in a consenting adults resolution at the convention, which they passed. And then after they passed this, conservative Democrats, oh my God, the Young Dems have passed a sex plank urging free sexual activities in the state. And so there was a lot of attacks on the Young Dems. Governor Warren Knowles, a Republican at the time, had a little fun in a story which even got picked up by the New York Times. He complained of Homocrats versus Democrats. What are we coming to? Next, I want to talk about David Adamany, and I describe him as a friend at court. David Adamany got involved in a case that was very important. He was from Janesville. He got his AB and JD at Harvard. He was a professor of political science at UW from 72 to 77. And he was appointed Secretary of Revenue by Governor Lucey. And during that time, he came out to Lucey as a gay man because he wanted to represent Paul Safransky at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And since he was a member of the executive branch as Secretary of Revenue, he needed special permission from the Supreme Court to represent him. And so he knew the issue might arise, and so he personally told Lucey of his own situation. He went on to a very distinguished career. He was president of Wayne State in 82 to 97 and later president of Temple University. Now, the Safransky case was involving a house parent from Southern Colony. This was an institution for troubled youth in the state, and he was confronted in 72 for being gay. Now, the superintendent of Southern Colony had forced other gay men to resign from the institution. But Safransky was that kind of new homosexual following Stonewall. He was a member of Milwaukee's Gay People's Union. He wasn't going to resign, so he got fired. Now, he appealed to the State Personnel Board. State Personnel Board, they upheld the firing. They tend to do that in bureaucracies. But the State Personnel Board went even further and made amongst its findings, homosexual activity is contrary to the generally recognized and accepted standards of morality. Pretty big sweeping statement. So now, David Adamany helped prepare the brief for Safransky. He made the argument that self-avowed homosexuality is not a cause for discharge. Again, he's talking about conduct. He's not talking about criminal acts. His mere status as self-avowed homosexual was the reason he got discharged. He noticed witnesses testified there had never been any untoward activity, and that the superintendent had said, I would have terminated any acknowledged homosexual. Again, not because of any criminal acts, but simply because of his status as a member of a group. Adamany cited a 1973 Ankafora case, where the opinion in that case said the time has now come for private consenting adult homosexuality to enter the sphere of constitutionally protected interest. He was ahead of his time. It would take quite a number of years for the U.S. Supreme Court to catch up with him. He was making his arguments here in the Capitol before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, their chambers here. In Adamany's brief, he noted, Safransky's not required to lie about his life. That would deny him his First Amendment rights of speech and association. He notes a double standard to permit heterosexual staff members to freely discuss their private lifestyles while limiting the rights of homosexuals to do so is the kind of discrimination condemned by the Supreme Court. And he noted it was impermissible to assume that a homosexual does not have a male image. The state may not assume the homosexual may not portray a correct image. Now, regarding the Personnel Board finding, which Adamany attacked, he said, that's an unconstitutionally vague condition of employment. He said there was no substantial evidence in the whole record that homosexual activity was contrary to generally accepted standards, and that the Personnel Board had no judicially cognizable expertise in making such a finding. You know, why were these people deciding personnel matters making such a broad, sweeping gesture? He did a sort of Brandeis brief trying to show that it reflected changing attitudes towards homosexuals. He cited Marcus Welby, 60 Minutes, and all these kinds of things. He got down in the weeds. He noted that homosexuality itself was not a crime. He noted that certain sex acts are prohibited, but those same sex acts were banned for heterosexuals as well as for homosexuals. He noted members of the same sex may embrace or kiss privately. They may also live together without legal sanction. and that in the state, homosexual magazines and newspapers circulated freely, including the Milwaukee Gay People's Union, GPU News. One place where those homosexuals lived together was this house on Jennifer Street, which was the center of a large gay social circle. Included Ted Pierce, shown here, an African-American gentleman, with many of the other gays who were part of this pre-Stonewall social circle and network. Now, how the Safransky story ends. Robert Warren was the Attorney General. In his reply brief, he argued homosexuality or sexual perversion is abnormal, sick, and many homosexuals are child molesters, dealing with a terrible stereotype. The brief from the Attorney General cited the Bible, Thomas Aquinas, and John Calvin. It also stated, great authorities, that the general population has a well-known disgust for homosexuals and refer to them as queer or strange. Now, the court upheld Safransky's firing, but ducked the broad general questions. The court ruling said, the question of whether an individual may be terminated for homosexual status is not an issue and need not be determined in their parsing of legal issues. I think they were wrong, but they did. And they also said about the personnel board, no evidence was submitted as to the finding, therefore the finding is not supported by evidence. So Adamany was successful in forcing the state to back down from the broad sweeping positions taken by the superintendent of Southern Colony and by the personnel board. Next, I want to turn to Professor Harvey Goldberg, famous history professor, lecturer on campus. He participated in a show called The Gay Response, which was shown on WHA-TV in May 23rd of 1977. Again, in that last lecture from Jack Mitchell, we heard about the whole WHA milieu was part of that Wisconsin idea. And this response show came about in the days of Anita Bryant and the hostility that was being more expressed towards homosexuals at that time. And so it was to present challenges to that hostility. Now, Goldberg was the chief host. He was sort of on air for a lot of the time during this half-hour show. He made 5 key points. Homosexuals are organizing themselves in this post-Stonewall era. They're making demands for legal equality. They are not so bizarre or heinous as they're thought. They're coming out of self-effacement, and they have something to offer society. Here is very much a narrative put forth by a Wisconsin academic different from the one we began with from the 19th century. There were also 3 lesbians and 3 gay men in the discussion group, and they noted a push for non-discrimination legislation. Next, I'm going to turn to the efforts for sex reform. This was Assemblyman Lloyd Barbie. He got elected to the legislature in 1966. And in 1967, he introduced a whole series of sex reform legislation, including legalizing homosexuality, what later becomes the Consenting Adults Bill. So again, this is before Stonewall. It's following the Young Dems and their platform. And in 1971, following Stonewall, Barbie proposes a bill not only to prohibit discrimination on basis of sexual orientation, again a first, but he proposes same-sex marriage. This has to be one of the first proposals in the nation for same-sex marriage coming to the Wisconsin legislature. Now, Barbie didn't expect these bills to pass, but he thought they were educative of both his colleagues and the legislature, which perhaps certainly needed education. His own statement made in '73, the change to eliminate distinctions of race, sex, sexual preferences are long overdue. Let us work to effect such changes vigorously. In 1975 session, Barbie was in his last session, he passed the baton on sex reform to David Clarenbach. David was the youngest person elected to Wisconsin office in 1972 as a member of the Dane County Board of Supervisors. He then got elected to the legislature in '74 and overlapped with Barbie for just that one session. David was masterful in framing the debate about sex reform. Barbie's bills had really been more about the sexual revolution, let's make it legal kind of thing. David was much more focused that discrimination against gays is not permissible, not whether homosexuality was good, and that Consenting Adults Bill was about privacy, a zone of privacy, which you saw back in that Ankefora case from Maryland, that should be constitutionally protected or protected by the state's laws. Now, in debating the Consenting Adults Bill, the state did adopt a statement on morality. I think there's a little irony about that, and I'm going to explain that. This shows a postcard from Hurley, which billed itself as the nightlife capital of Wisconsin. Now, Hurley had been portrayed in Edna Ferber's novel Come and Get It as a wide-open town for prostitution that served the loggers and miners of northern Wisconsin, a lot of single men up there. And I can remember even as an undergraduate when I would drive by the burlesque theater, Shirley from Hurley was the headliner there on the burlesque. So Hurley had quite a reputation. Anyway, it was the legislator, June Jarnitsky from Iron River, whose district included Hurley, that proposed this language in the Consenting to Adults bill, that the state recognizes that it has a duty to encourage high moral standards. Although the state does not regulate the private sexual conduct of consenting adults, the state does not condone or encourage any forms of sexual contact outside of marriage. This was sort of a fig leaf that the legislature adopted. I'm going to sort of focus at the end on 3 studies that helped the passage of these things. One was done by Louis Crew, shown here with his partner, Ernest Clay. Crew was at the University of Stevens Point from 79 to 84. He was faculty advisor there to the Gay People's Students Union at Stevens Point. He had founded Integrity, which was the gay Episcopal group. He believed the Holy Spirit was an androgynous force in the universe. He had nicknamed Sister Thorn in the Flesh and Fleischer for Truth. As I said, he was at Stevens Point, and while he was there, he conducted this study. But prior to coming to Stevens Point, he had published a book called The Gay Academic. And in The Gay Academic, which was published in '79, he dedicated it to the memory of all the gay martyrs. And he had an introduction, an antidote to hemlock. And he shows a picture of a famous painting of the death of Socrates. And one of the charges against Socrates, you may remember, was that he was a corrupter of youth. He forced them to think, open their minds. And of course, for that, he had to drink poison. So, Crew's argument was there's another choice. You don't have to drink the poison. He noted that few academics were with the street youth at Stonewall, but even in the most isolated carols, there will never be the same again. He was a member of the founding of the Gay Academic Union, and he noted gay academics are building for their own freedom. A picture of the gay academic, of course, with a purple color. Now, in 1980, he surveyed district attorneys. One of the arguments about the whole sex reform laws was that, yeah, there were these ancient laws, but they weren't really enforced, so why bother going through the political fight to repeal them? Well, he got 51 of 71 DAs to respond to his study, and he found that each year approximately 86 persons in the state were arrested, 83 prosecuted, and 71 convicted of homosexual acts in this period. Highest number of cases occurred in Milwaukee, Eau Claire, and Waukesha counties, and that gay men had a stigma against them, often forcing them into an involuntary kind of self-oppression, making them live in constant fear of exposure and reprisal. The memory of that stigma shows here in the police record that Eldon Murray, who was editor of the Gay People's Union in Milwaukee, dug out from the United States Department of Justice, showing his own arrest record in the 50s and 60s for disorderly conduct-sex. Now, the messaging about the Consenting Adults Bill of sex reform tried to change it that it was not about homosexuals, it was about privacy, and that changing the sex laws would repeal the strictures against fornication, against adultery, and against cohabitation. So they were trying to sort of get some straight support for this effort, but when you look at the privacy coalitions supporting sex reform, they were all made up by gays and lesbians. They did have some allies in the WCLU, but there were no heterosexuals lobbying for sex reform for the laws against them. There was one group of 20 Lawrence University students who turned themselves into the Outagamie DA and proclaimed, "We have violated the fornication law." The DA declined to prosecute them. He didn't have the particulars of when and where it happened, so he said he couldn't really prosecute them. Anyway, the messaging for consenting adults was successful, and part of that success was due to efforts of people like Professor Martha Finman here. She was with the UW Law School. She again surveyed DAs. It was popular. You saw Teasdale did it. You saw Crew did it. She surveyed them on cohabitation crimes, and she showed that there were a range of 65 to 80 cases per year during the 1970s about cohabitation prosecutions. Of the DAs, 45% believed cohabitation was morally wrong and ought to be discouraged with criminal sanctions and prosecution. 36% of the DAs thought enforcement meant people who cohabit will do so discreetly, sort of keep cohabitators in the closet. And this study was often mentioned during the debate by proponents and opponents. Again, this was framing consenting adults about more than gay peoples. Her arguments were supported by another study done by Stephen Tordella. He was with the Applied Population Lab at the Department of Rural Sociology here at UW-Madison, and he used census data, which of course they had a lot in the population lab. He showed that approximately 22,000 Wisconsin households contained unrelated persons of the opposite sex who could be classified as living together. Now, he said for those never married under age 35, that number increased to 5 or 10%, perhaps suggesting more sexuality was happening in this younger cohort. And his conclusion was living together is a phenomenon affecting a significant portion of the population of Wisconsin. So his study on cohabitation was also sent to the Senate committee, which was studying the sex reform laws. So I've tried to show how the link between the university and the state and passage of those laws was successful in the early 1980s. Was there really an academic influence on this narrative or not? You can argue this question, but Gillen's book went through a couple printings. Serving House's research was noted by Kinsey. We got to remember Kinsey was not alone. Glover's studies was republished in a book of studies about gay men. Adamani's court arguments eventually went out. And the legislative debate in the 1980s did use the studies of Finman and Tordella as part of the public discourse. They were picked up in the newspaper accounts. And so that these Wisconsin academics, in sort of sharing this Wisconsin idea, both reflected, participated, and revealed sort of the changing attitudes, the narrative on non-normative sexuality in the state. So the last thing I want to sort of cover is that I do think the pre-Stonewall and post-Stonewall connections can be seen. You saw that the shared attitudes prior to Stonewall, rejecting the criminality and sickness in the gay community, had already been established. There was a reality that homosexuality was statewide, shown in this pre-Stonewall studies. There were links to university committees. There were shared skills in networking communications before Stonewall. There's even a shared social geography. That east side of Madison, Jennifer Street area was also very active as a source of many gay fundraising and political events after Stonewall, as it was sort of before Stonewall for a social circle. So the answer to my earlier questions that I began, there is a Wisconsin gay history, and the UW academics helped reveal it and shape it. And so the link between gay history and the university, I think, is quite clear. And it's at many others that I could have talked about as well. But my time is limited, and I've even run over. Thank you very much.